Yeah, a real honor to be here because, Ken talked about surprises on the faculty side about how things turn out, but I also experienced surprises on Rick's side of how things turn out sometimes. In that I dedicated one of my recent books to Rick. It was called Identity Excellence, or Identity in Action, Christian Excellence in All of Life, written really for college students. And I dedicated it to him, and I then sent him a copy, and we were at UNC walking around, and Rick made the comment, he goes, "Perry, I don't even remember half the things you said I told you." And I think, isn't that ministry, right? And isn't that teaching, right? That it's the things you think you're nailing home that for certain they'll get, maybe they don't, but then there's those other half of things you've forgotten you even said on a whim. And those are formative. And Rick formed me in so many ways. And Crew did as well at Rice University. And one of the best things they did was they gave me a holistic Christian education. And a bit of that has been talked about. I hear that throughout this conference today. And you'll see that in my talk here, is that right? Acknowledging that we're more than just professors. More than we're students. In fact, I asked my students to call me Brother Perry because I don't want them to, I want that equality that Kim was talking about. Now, though, I'm challenged to have them call me Servant Perry because maybe that's the better term to use. But I'm going to talk about hospitality, but I'm going to do what professors usually do. We need to get the larger context, right? And so I want to talk about placing hospitality in a larger context within higher education. And first, I want to start with just the basic question. Well, what is the purpose of higher education? And I've actually asked this of about 400 college students all across the nation. And surprisingly, there hasn't been a qualitative study. There's a bunch of quantitative ones, but qualitative studies that actually let students answer what is the purpose of higher education. So what do you think they answer? Careers, number one. What else? No, they don't say that. Now, they may be too embarrassed to say that, but no, they don't say that. That is up there. You get, actually, this will make professors proud. They do say learning. Often, learning varies, especially within their discipline, or even learning broadly. Like, I'm here to kind of gain a broad understanding. But yes, kind of I want to find myself is a term that you'll hear. To figure out who I am is their third thing they'll say. Anybody else? What else might they say? Yes, in some ways, I would put that to the fifth one there, preparation for adulthood. They say, yeah, this is kind of just the next step. Although for first gens, it's not, because it's kind of a new step for them and their family. But yeah, it's a next step. The other one is, of course, social connections. That could be either professionally, especially if you're talking to business majors, or friends, right? I mean, I just, like my son even said, he was talking to a guy, "Why are you Russian?" My son, by the way, is Russian, and he goes, "Well, I just want some dudes at my wedding, right? I want a wedding party." I mean, my son didn't think that was a very good reason, right? But then there's obtain material needs, and then the very instrumental, to get a degree. Now, any observations about this list? Yep, it was just, well, you guys got it right away. It's all about me. It's not about being a better citizen. It's not about how I can contribute to others. They don't say, well, I'm actually learning in order to benefit society and further human flourishing. It's all about me. And I think it's helpful to understand that context. Now, this is developmentally not surprising with 18-year-olds if you know about sort of developmental theory, but still helpful to recognize this. And to think about, okay, where do we want to take them? What do we hope is the purpose of university? And also, too, not only for professors, it's not like professors don't have this, that they aren't self-oriented with their list about what is the purpose of being a professor, but where do we want to take them? Actually, I found one of the best summaries of this is actually one of the founders, you might say, or who wrote sort of the blueprint for the university when it first started. He actually taught in a school in Paris before the University of Paris. But I thought this was one of the best summaries of what you hope, really, higher education would accomplish. right? It's to restore within us the divine likeness, a likeness to which us is a form, but to God is a nature. Boy, a very different focus than self-focus. And that puts everything in a whole different context. And I would argue, even for professors, that should be our understanding of what is, especially Christian professors, that should be our understanding of what the purpose of higher ed is. The problem is, and I've chronicled this in a book, is that contemporary higher education in America has slowly but surely reduced our identities. And it largely reduces it to being a student, and perhaps we'll add on a couple other ones that are important at the time. Or for professionals, it's like you're professional. I mean, we heard that today in some of the talks, right? That, like I was eating lunch and somebody was talking about, one of the crew staff was talking about this professor who, no, that was a talk earlier, how this professor, had never had anybody in his office really ask about his personal life, right? They didn't care for him as a whole human being, right? It's all just annual review, tenure track, what are you producing? And hopefully as Christians, we have a lot different vision of who you are as a human being. And it starts with understanding, first and foremost, we're all made in the image of God, both students and professors. And that means it's something we are. We didn't lose it after the fall, as Genesis 9:6 talks about it. But it's also something we need to become. And that makes a big difference in how we understand the overall purpose of the university. And it also makes a big difference in what motivates us when we're engaged in the work of the university. But we're failing. This is from a study that I'm doing right now of the top Christian universities and the top Christian liberal arts college in America. We've asked students from what gives you worth and value? These are Christian students. Only 22% said they derive their worth and value from God. The rest, they derive their worth and value from right accomplishments, social relationships, or maybe what their parents think about them, their peers, especially for college students, or social accomplishments. I can come into a room and light up a room. That's where they derive their worth and value. No wonder they have mental health problems. In fact, the psych literature is fairly clear. If you have contingent sources of self-worth, it's correlated with high mental health issues, higher depression, higher anxiety, versus if you have non-contingent self-worth, and of course, that's where you find, if you find your worth and value in God, that you're made in God's image, that's the start. And I would ask the same question about professors. Where are your professors finding their worth and value? We've had some references to that. Rick was talking about that earlier, right? How many pubs you get, building your CV, getting tenure. I was just at a mentoring talk here at Baylor, whereas I'm mentoring an assistant professor, and this young assistant professor asked a question of, like, how do you get perspective? I go to my church and I get the kind of right perspective, but then I go to my professional conference and I feel like I need to be doing all these things. And I actually talked about taking the Sabbath. I said, you know what? Take a Sabbath, because it really is a measure of how much do you trust God with your future? And I take a Jewish Sabbath, actually, along those lines we talked about. But yeah, it starts with, first of all, that we're made in God's image. And that we have, but we're also supposed to grow into it, right? And it's been defaced. We haven't lost it, but we need to recover it, as Hugh St. Victor mentioned. So this is actually one of the ways I help try to remind, and I think it'd be good for Christian professors to do this, is actually remind students of this truth. First of all, your worth is found in God. And I have put this on my syllabus to remind them of this. Because right now, I can tell you Christian universities, and actually I do studies with secular universities too, their students were failing at having students ground their worth and value in a solid foundation of being made in God's image. And that's all students, not right? No matter if you're Christian or not. Now, going from this, though, this foundational theological truth hopefully should illumine something about how we think about our theological anthropology, or how we view ourselves as human beings. And This, I think, is vitally important. Like God, one of the things of being made in God's image is like God, we have many identities. God is shepherd, father, king, all these things. We can argue about how that works scripturally and what that reveals, but we also, too, have aspects of who we are revealed by our identities. And the second thing is, like God, who already is excellent in those identities, we are to become excellent in them. And this is what I've heard around here today, actually, is, hey, I'm going to be an excellent father and not just an excellent professor. I'm not going to let the academy reduce me to one of those identities. Moreover, I'm going to keep central the key one, but then I'm going to seek to be excellent in all these. And sometimes they conflict, and sometimes I have to order my identities, or as Augustine would say, order our loves for my different identities. And that's the key vision we need for what does it mean to be an excellent Christian professor. Now, scripturally, where do I, kind of ground this? Well, I think one of the best ways to see how this is grounded is in 2 Peter here 1, 3 through 6. And I think it's important sometimes how we've reduced our view of what it means to be made in God's image or even excellence. We reduce it to moral issues instead of our whole lives. And you see this sometimes even in the translation of this passage of what happens here. We, of course, we are called by God, who through his own glory and excellence, arete, same word Aristotle uses for excellence. That means, by God's excellence, we're called, but then we're called, right, to become partakers of the divine nature, to supplement our faith. And the famous Augustinian phrase is faith-seeking understanding. I would say Augustine's wrong, scripturally speaking. It should be faith-seeking excellence and then understanding. Because you only get real understanding when you first have your moral goal or even a larger goal. I say the problem with a lot of translations is they translate it virtue, and it really should be excellence, meaning excellence in any area, which is a moral goal. It's the same arete that's in Philippians 4:8. Think about excellence, arete. So this is the goal then for Christian professors, and actually for all of us. What does it mean to be excellence, human image bearers of God in all our different identities? The good thing is our identity is already foundational, so that motivates us, and then through Christ and the experience of God's grace, that motivates us to be excellence. It's not something we have to, get our worth by. So, how do we be excellent image bearers of God? This is the how-to now. We have the motivation, the theological anthropology understanding. Now, how do we teach others to do it, or be it ourselves? Well, the key here is this, and this is what scholars of excellence, Eric Erickson, he passed away, Anders Erickson, passed away recently, right? He says, this is how we learn to become excellent. And this is what psychologists and positive psychology are finding too. And this is what, in fact, derailed the study of character 100 years ago, is you had these people, Hartshorne and May, who did these experiments and said, you know what we find out? Somebody's honest in this context, in this experiment, but they're not honest in another. And so they made the wrong conclusion, there's no such thing as character. We can't teach character, so psychology was set back. It wasn't until we recovered positive psychology that we learned this. But now what we learn is, no, Hartshorne and May just got it wrong. Just like in sports or just like learning an instrument, you have to learn what it means to be excellent in each of those areas, and it doesn't easily transfer, right? I may be loving with students, but I may neglect the emotional needs of my wife and forget her birthday, right? And now that hasn't happened, don't worry. But, I don't know, you'd have to talk to her on some of that. She'd probably say sometimes, maybe on the emotional needs. But, right, there's a sense in which you have to learn a virtue or excellence in each area of identity. And that's what we know now. We know this from Scripture, but also from study as well. So, what does that involve then? We have to learn, and this is what I've heard all day here, and this is what Crew did for me in college. Rick taught me how to, he introduced this book called Master Your Money, and we did a group Bible study on this book. I passed it on to my dad. It was influential on my dad. I've now passed it on to my students, because it's funny how many graduate students don't have no clue about, they haven't taken economics. They have no clue about how to steward their money or steward their body, as we've heard about today, or steward their culture. But they have to learn each of these. And this is what I heard Ken talking about. He does in his Bible study. Basically, he's doing this. He's helping those students not just learn to be excellent biologists, excellent historians, excellent accountants, excellent social workers. He's teaching them to be excellent human beings and image bearers of God in all dimensions of their whole person. And that's what great discipleship, and that's what the university, Christian professors should be about, is doing that. So what are the necessary excellent qualities of then being excellent in each of these identities? And particularly, we're talking today, and I'm speaking today, about people who are concerned with what does it mean to be an excellent Christian professor? Well, I would argue it's these 8 things, and I'm not going to go into all these 8 things because I'm going to just talk about 2 of them, but it's these 8 things that are required to be excellent. And if you miss any of these 8, you're really missing a lot. I teach student affairs, and what you see on, for example, Christian student affairs, sometimes you'll get these Christian colleges that teach like, don't drink or don't have sex before marriage. Well, that's hardly excellence. It's like saying I'm an excellent husband because I don't commit adultery, or I'm an excellent neighbor because I don't steal from my neighbor, right? It's only focusing on rules, and rules are for beginners, and we always need them, and we always need to keep them. Excellent practitioners always need to practice rules, but we need these other things. Are we giving them a vision for excellence? What's an excellent sexual life? What's an excellent neighbor like? What are the virtues associated with that? What are the practices associated with that? Let's not just be the people of rules. Let's be the people with visions of God-ordained excellence. You see this in Mark 10 when he talks to the Pharisees and they ask about the divorce rule. He says, don't be concerned with the rule. Be concerned with the vision that God gave you about marriage. That's what we're concerned with. So, how do we think about professors in God's stories? I would encourage you to ask all your professors or your professor colleagues these questions, because this is a good way to help them think theologically within the Christian story about their profession. What is it about your profession or discipline that reflects God's good creation? Economics, accounting, right? We're giving accountability is a virtue. Economics, stewarding resources. Nurses are not alone in caring, and I will say I'm married to a nurse, and so I can also tell you their vices, as we talked about earlier, but right, there is this virtue of caring for nurses, health, for doctors. What is fallen, problematic about your profession or discipline? When I talk to Christian faculty members, I says, this one's easy to teach. Just bring a 50-year-old in who's like an old accountant, an old social worker, and they can tell you every problem with their discipline. In fact, that's what they do at lunches all the time, is whine about the fallenness of their profession and discipline. But, right, they need to know about that. But then this is the better one. What does it mean to redeem your broken discipline? How does it mean to reverse the fall in your profession? Right, because Jesus came, Colossians talks about Christ's redemption wasn't just for personal salvation, although that is vital and foremost, but it's also to redeem all of creation, which includes our cultural creations. So that includes our disciplines, our professions that we're asked to steward. We are all, if you're a professor, you are a steward of a discipline. That is part of your God-given thing that even in Genesis 1 there is laid out. How can you redeem it? Reverse the fall in your discipline. And then what would it look like for your discipline in its ideal state? Now, criminal justice professors, it might disappear in heaven. Some other professions as well. But also it's helpful to think about, what would it look like in the restoration for your discipline? So that's a start, placing your discipline in God's story. Now, I would argue that then you have a clear purpose about what your purpose should be as a professor. It's not just, I often see this with Christian professors, it's like, okay, I'm pious here, I have a deep walk with God. I'm active in church. I do service work. And then I'm kind of just, what I do in my profession is just basically copies what any professor would do at UT, A&M, any secular professor, right? It's just, that's the same, but we call it the two spheres approach. And I call it Christ-added learning, right? You got your Christian life here, but my professional life is kind of unchanged. But I would say, no, your very core of your purpose as a professor needs to be changed. That you're about the creation and redemption of learners and learning. And that's a cosmic story. It's not just about, although it includes individual salvation of your colleagues, of your grad students, of your other students, undergrads, but it involves, helping redeem your discipline, helping redeem that bad scholarship, helping redeem bad teaching, for example. Now, we get to the point I was asked to talk about, hospitality. Because you have to realize hospitality is a virtue, or it's actually interesting because it means a virtue and a practice. Within the profession, the specific profession here we're talking about, hospitality in other areas, I just talked to a guy who does hospitality for a living, but he does it for huge 20,000 events. That's different than hospitality for professors. So this is a virtue we have to learn about and study in particular contexts to really habituate it and make it second nature in our lives. Well, first of all, let's do what we need to do. We need to place hospitality in the Christian story. First of all, God's the best, greatest host. Look at how God set the table in Genesis 1. He provided the best meals. He provided the best atmosphere, right? You can't outdo God in hospitality of Genesis 1. And also, too, we need to realize our students are image bearers of God, all of them, and they deserve the best hospitality that we give them. But two, we need to realize, and this is important, and this is what Rick referred to when he introduced me, and that is, when we think about hospitality, we need to realize that there's limits to it. And I see this all the time. I teach student affairs staff, future ones, who are going to go into student affairs. And basically, in their view, Christian hospitality is giving people what they want. So we have Muslim and Hindu students on campus, and they want a religious student group. Let them have it. They want to be RAs at a Christian university. Let them do it. Versus going, well, maybe Christian hospitality is different and has some boundaries. For example, in ancient Israel, strangers, the strangers or aliens among them weren't supposed to set the agenda. In fact, you weren't supposed to be corrupted by the strangers and aliens among them by worshiping their gods. However, you were supposed to welcome them, love them, remember you were strangers and aliens in Egypt, and show them hospitality, but you don't adopt their practices or worship their gods. Same in 2nd and 3rd John, which often we think of as books about love, but actually they're also about hospitality, both. And particularly 2nd John talks about, hey, if people come to you without bringing the teaching of Christ, don't even welcome them into your home. So there's limits to our hospitality. I just had a class discussion about, should we let non-Christians be Welcome Week leaders at Baylor? We had it was split half and half, and they debated it, and it was really good. But it raises some questions, right? We have to sometimes, in order to preserve Christian faithfulness, draw boundaries in our hospitality. When I had a Muslim student over recently and family, we don't take down our crosses. We don't not pray before meals. We explain to them, we educate them why we do those things. But we still practice those hospitality. There's line drawing in our hospitality. And then, of course, Christian hospitality requires suffering, requires the fruit of the Spirit. And of course, the end of the story is the same as the start of the story. We find Jesus is the ultimate host, preparing a place for us. He's going to drink a meal with us. And I'm sorry, Baptist, he's going to have wine again in that meal. Now, what does this look like in practice? I want to give you some examples from my research of students talking about the hospitality that they've been shown, or perhaps some professors also talking about what they do with hospitality. For example, here's one which I think connects, I actually put in how it connects to tune your heart to joy that we heard earlier today, is this student was struck by a chemistry professor's joy. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't ever seen a chemistry professor showing joy. And so this was quite something to me about how, and I love this line, right? He said, and this is, the question asked is, what was something morally formative to you in your university experience? This was what was morally formative. This professor says, the world has plenty of grumpy scientists. We don't need any more of those. We need scientists who are joyful and happy and want to be there. And this person said, that sounds like something someone who believes in Jesus would say. I thought, yep, that's fruit of the Spirit right there. Or the classroom, what might it look like? David Smith, if you haven't read his book on Christian teaching, everybody should read it, even, if you aren't teaching, because he gives a vision he's a professor at Calvin, and he gives a vision for how Christianity transforms your teaching. I just had him on. We were mentoring graduate students at Baylor, and I had him by Zoom, and he was telling about this practice he does in a class where, instead of just having a lecture, or even, these days you get a circle or maybe you have breakout groups or something, but he does something different. He goes, you know what? I want to create a quality of community in my classroom in which there's a quality of love and care for each other. So I actually assign groups of 4, and I try to get them out of their get a sense of the groups immediately and try and get them away from their, close friends and stuff and differentiate it. And I have them say, okay, you're going to pair up in 4s and you're going to be caring for this person the whole semester. You're going to be asking about them when they don't show up for class. You're going to help them with homework if they need help, or you're going to go to them for help. And you're going to ask each other how you're doing on grades and tests. We're going to commit, in this education class, he teaches education now, he used to teach German, we're going to create a community of care, of love, of Christian love in this class. And that's going to transform it. Also, too, what creative ideas do you present for reversing the fall in your discipline? I would say that would be another one. I try and do that when I teach my higher ed administrators or student affairs administrators. And the reason why I put this one up here is this. You guys know this. Most academics write books like this. 9 chapters describing a problem, deconstructing something, and 1 very thin chapter with very unrealistic suggestions about how to make things better. Christian professors should be ones writing the 1 chapter with a problem and 9 chapters about how to redeem the situation. We need to be creative and redemptive thinkers. And that's what I try and do. I don't want my classes filled. In fact, I just got a blog post from a Christian professor, and that's kind of what he was doing. He was teaching us, and I went back at him. I says, all you're doing is teaching your students to deconstruct and identify the fall, which is valuable. We need to think critically and identify the fall in the discipline, but you're just teaching them to be cynics. If you only teach that, they'll just become cynical. Are you teaching them to be creative and redemptive problem solvers in the world, in their discipline, or in their books, or in their scholarship? That kind of thing. This is, I think, a great example. Some of you may know George Yancey, who teaches at Baylor now, but this is from one of his, a comment I received from a student at Baylor about how Yancey presented a vision, taught a sociology class on race and ethnicity, but wasn't just deconstructing. Not to say we don't identify. We have lots of things to identify in the fall in the United States or in other countries about ethnicity and race, but presenting a vision for how Christianity can inform redemptive steps going forward in this particular identity. What does it mean to be an excellent fill in your ethnic group or a racial group? Now, I do say, I don't want to ignore that the fall does happen. We do need to deconstruct, but I think for Christian professors, and we've touched on it already here, as Ken has too, that we need to be careful about how we use power in a public setting. He talked about, the psychology professor being, watch out for how you're using power when you ask a student to pray with. And I think we should, of all people, be very sensitive to power relations and how being a professor at a state university or even at Baylor might, and I'm dealing with other students, might influence that. Because, I hear from my students, like a University of Washington student talked about it, he had an English professor, the whole class is focused on how to critique Fox News. Or I had another one say his philosophy of religion class, the professor came in and says, my purpose here is to make you atheists. right? We know the abuse of power and have tons of stories about it. But we also, I know another professor at a state university that one of my students told me about. He was a Christian, but using his power in a bad way, just to badmouth liberal politics. Versus a faithful Christian professor, and I would say you've seen some before you today, who I've inspired by, that are sensitive to the use of power when it comes to these things, show intellectual humility. For example, so I used to always teach a church state class. I'm talking about one of the things interesting about Islam is it doesn't have a pacifist movement. And then I had an independent study with a Muslim student who said, well, actually there's a small Pakistani group of pacifists in Pakistan. So it's like, okay, I need to be able to learn from my students, show humility, and take into account those things where I'm limited and fallen as well. I've already kind of hit that one. So here are some other, here's an example I thought of how just a Christian witness. This is of a Christian professor, but this is a student talking about how, they themselves are kind of activists, but they took this political theory class. It was constitutional development, and how she was inspired by the professor's ability to use power, to actually show different sides, and how she learned, and that was really inspiring to her. Now, that being said, here's another student talking about inspired by a professor standing up for truth in the classroom. So, this is where hospitality and wisdom and thinking about power in the classroom are very important for us to try and think through as Christian professors in our hospitality. Now, I want to close with what Ken has talked a lot about too, is where are the areas where we can best help professors learn how to do Christian hospitality, and that is outside of class. I've done studies of this. I've coded hundreds of interviews of students telling me where they've been influenced religiously and morally. It's not in the classroom most often. In fact, most often, to be honest, it's outside the classroom in the co-curricular among their peers and staff members. It's not always faculty. Faculty often kind of think of themselves too highly on their influence in these areas. But when it is, it's often faculty outside the classroom, in those office hours, praying for students like Ken talked about, or in this situation, just some advice that a professor, this was a Christian professor giving some advice to a student, but being open and meeting with students. Or in this case, this professor, he talks about how he creates a certain situation in his office that has great chairs. His office is, like he said, a museum in which he makes it as inviting as possible, has snacks in his office because they always come in for food, and he tries to be the ultimate host with how he designs his office. It's very intentional. You don't often think about it. In my field, we talk about integration of faith and learning, but not often do we think about it actually starts with your office and how you design your office. Just like great hospitality often starts with how you design the room that you come in, or chairs forward, or how you design the classroom. Are they just forward? Are they in small groups so people actually talk to each other and get to know their name, or in a circle where people face each other? All these things, just designing the office. And like Ken mentioned earlier, who gave out a book, this professor also bought books and gave out books to other students who came in, which I think is great, If you have a stash of books, you can give students that may address some of these things. Whoops, I was a little ahead of myself there. But those are the two books there at the bottom he talked about keeping for students. You can imagine, especially with mental health needs, how some books related to, say, anxiety, depression, those kinds of things might catch the eye of certain students in your office. But also, too, really, I find it's again outside the classroom, often with meals with students, where real change happens and real wisdom is offered, and where students are open to hearing that wisdom. Here we have a professor who habitually would grab a meal with a student and changed her life, because that's what changed her major. She realized about a third of students often at Baylor come in pre-med, and this professor was so in tune with the student from her writing that she could advise her where to go, and she went into social work and was loving it, Just vocational discernment and help there. And also meals at home. I thought this was a great idea. And I'll close with this one of just opening up your home, kind of what Kim was talking about earlier, right? In that, are there certain times? Think about those international students. We do the same thing. My wife is really involved with our international students at Baylor. And right, every holiday they don't have places to go, so usually our home is then filled with graduate students who are international students. And it's a wonderful time to talk about the meaning, especially of a lot of these holidays like Christmas or Thanksgiving, when you're reaching out. I just thought it was fascinating, even the wording here. It really made me feel loved and accepted here. Just to be invited, even it's a large class. But this professor, and part of it was cultural, I think, here too, but being invited to the professor's home, that makes a big difference. So hopefully, if you need some other ideas for perhaps hospitality, there's some other blog posts on our website. I'm the editor of Christian Scholars Review, and sometimes you can get a lot of good ideas from professors there who have actually just written about some of these things as well. But thank you very much.